faculty, welcome those of you who are from our off-campus community. We're very excited. I'm Professor Laurie Brand. I'm the Director of the Middle East Studies program here. And this the Middle East Studies program, we're honored to have a wonderful association, relatively new but growing, with the Farhang Foundation. The Farhang Foundation is responsible for all of you who are here and taking Persian classes or Persian studies classes. You can thank them for it. It's thanks to their efforts, their communications, their coordination with the university that we're able to bring you these programs, which we're just beginning and which we're hoping to build on in the future. As part of that cooperation with the Farhang Foundation, we're pleased to begin this year a series which was envisioned from the beginning, and that is an annual series of distinguished lecturers in Persian and Iranian studies. This particular year, because we're launching it, we wanted to seek out what some have described as we couldn't have gotten a better representative for, and that is Professor Rudi Matthee. Professor Rudi Matthee is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Delaware. His publications, he has more than 50 articles on Qajar and on Safavid Iran, as well as works on Egypt. He has served as the director, or the president rather, of the Association for the Study of Persianate Societies on 2 different occasions. He is the editor or the co-editor of a number of top journals and other publications dealing with Iranian studies and Persian society. He has numerous books, in addition to the many articles that he's written, numerous books, a number of which have won major prizes in the field of Iranian studies or Middle East studies more broadly. I don't want to take more of your time. Professor Matthee, we couldn't have had a better person to launch this series this year. We're extremely pleased that he was able to join us. We're looking forward to his lecture this afternoon, the topic of which is here, and looking forward also tomorrow to the topic of Near East or West, which will be, again, in the same room, the same time tomorrow. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Rudi Matthee first.
Thank you very much. Can you all understand me and hear me when I talk like this? People in the back, including? Okay, very good. Well, let me begin by thanking USC for inviting me this afternoon and tomorrow, as well as the Farhang Foundation for their generosity, and most particularly Professors Hani Khafipour and Laurie Brand for being instrumental in bringing me here. I'm going to talk today about 18th century historiography in Iran. 18th century is a bit of a black hole, so to speak. Very few sources, dark and dangerous land, very few people went, not much writing coming out of the country, and yet pivotal, I think, in a roundabout way in the process of self-imagination and self-identification of Iranians over time, following the 18th century. So that will be one theme of my talk. More particularly, I'm going to talk about Nadia Shah, and I will flesh him out for those who don't know him, which may be perhaps even a majority, because he's not necessarily well known anymore, even though he's very important and very well known in the 18th century in Europe, as I will point out. So the 18th century in Iran can literally be said to have ended in 1800, in exactly 1800, because it's in that year that John Malcolm, and how do I go from one slide to the next? I guess I have to do it this way. It is in that year that John Malcolm visited the country as the first British ambassador to the court of Fath Ali Shah, the ruler of a newly established dynasty, the Qajars. The first in a long sequence of diplomats representing British interests, and especially the growing interest of the British in India, in competition with the French and the Russians at the time. Malcolm represented a new world in the making, an industrializing world in search of overseas market, a world built on progress and productivity, and a world of imperialism as agenda and organizing principle. Malcolm was also the harbinger of a new type of visitor by the same token, one who might still be mesmerized by the mystical, and poetic aura of Iran's venerable past, but who no longer stood in awe of the magnificent architecture of Safavid Iran, in part because there was little left of that, and in part because, unlike the visitors of yesteryear, the 17th century especially, the new visitor had his eyes on the future rather than on the past. Like many Europeans who followed him, Malcolm was a pragmatic envoy, an administrator and a military man who looked at Iran as a backward place, desperately in need of Western redemption and improvement. Malcolm juxtaposed conditions in Qajar Iran to the presumed characteristics of the ancient Roman Empire in its republican phase, contrasting the chaotic, venal, and oppressive nature of the former to the orderliness and citizenship-inspired regularity of the latter. He was a typical exponent of a sort of Georgian England in that sense. He opined that the country's inhabitants, that is Iran's inhabitants at the time, must be, quote unquote, civilized before they could be subdued. And in order to be civilized, they should learn about the world around them. The Persians, he concluded, quote, have no knowledge beyond their country. They understand no language but their own in Arabic, and though all the better classes read, the books to which they have access afford them little, if any, information, except of Asia, unquote. Now, Malcolm was no boor. His educational background, combined with his repeated exposure to Iran over time, made him deeply knowledgeable about and sympathetic to the country, its history, and its people, in ways that come out with forceful eloquence in his various writings. Most importantly, in his two-volume A History of Persia, massive work, 1815, which was the first Western account of the full span of Iranian history, and indeed the first historical account of Iran in any language. Remained a standard work on the subject for a goodly 70 years, and in time became a classic. And it is still very readable, I can assure you. And it's extremely informative because he used sources, that is Persian language sources, and some of which are no longer extant. But he also spoke as an imperialist, as well as an Orientalist, supremely convinced of the superiority of his worldview and ready to incorporate the country he visited into a new power constellation inspired by that same worldview. Yet Malcolm was also right. In the 3/4 century since the fall of Isfahan to Afghan invaders, 1722 is the date, and especially in the half-century since the devastating rule of Nadia Shah, 1736 to 47, Iranians had become largely disconnected from the wider world and certainly from developments in Europe. They had not only fallen behind, they didn't even realize that they had fallen behind. Now, this was a far cry from the situation in the 17th century. 100 years earlier, Iran, at that point ruled by the Safavids, the dynasty that fell in 1722, had been, if not the center of the world, the legendary land of the Sofi, that is the Shah, a term personified by the greatest ruler of the dynasty, Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1587 until 1629. Shah Abbas had connected his country to the world in unprecedented and accelerating ways. He had proclaimed Isfahan his capital, and here is Isfahan as it appears to you today, endowing it with a newly designed, awe-inspiring governmental, commercial, and religious center. He had turned this centrally located city into a nexus of trade routes connecting Iran, knitting Iran together and connecting it to the outside world, including the Persian Gulf. He had imported, that is, resettled a large number of Armenian merchants from the northwest to Isfahan, giving them a newly built suburb and commercial rights, especially over the import of Iran's most important export product, raw silk. Keen to diversify his commercial options, he had invited European merchants, most notably the English and the Dutch East India companies, and given them rights, among them the right to establish factories in his realm and to ply their trade via the newly emerging maritime route through the Persian Gulf, ultimately around the Cape to Europe. And ever since the reign of Shah Abbas, the Great, as he oftentimes is called, European visitors, merchants, missionaries, adventurers, and gentlemen scholars had visited the country in ever larger numbers, drawn to the realm of this visionary ruler, not just by the business opportunities it offered, but by stories about the safety of its roads, its legendary caravanserais, and the overall grandeur of the empire in the making. And of course, all of it focused on sort of the dazzling square, the royal square that still exists today, as you can see in this picture. Now, all of this energy and splendor, and here we have another picture of the splendor of the court of Shah Abbas and his successors, had come crashing down with the assault by Afghan tribesmen coming in from Kandahar, from what is today Afghanistan, that had led to the fall of Isfahan and the subsequent demise of the Safavids in 1722. Persian language sources speak of the horrors that ensued. And the few Europeans who still visited Iran in the aftermath of this echoed these words, returning with tales of utter ruin and destruction. The once glorious city, home to at least 300,000 people in the mid-17th century, was literally decimated to a desolate town, small desolate town of reportedly 30,000 inhabitants, where jackals howled among the ruins, which is one of the quotes from the visitors. And what followed was a century of utter chaos and anarchy, during which Iran, seemingly plunged into barbarism, became a dark and dangerous country, run by warlords and mostly shunned by the outside world. As the world at large was radically reconfigured in the 18th century, Iranians, relatively isolated, continued to live in a rather self-congratulatory, inward-looking mode, secure in the knowledge that their country was the envy of the world, which was basically their perception of the world in the Safavid period. You know, foreigners coming to Iran did so in the minds of Iranians to take advantage of business, to fantastic and abundant business opportunities, but also to pay homage to the Shah as the sort of the pivot of the universe, if you will. Now, my presentation today, and the larger project of which it is part, because this will ultimately turn into a book about perceptions and self-perception, identity building and nation building in Iran, is not about the transition between orderliness and chaos, represented and symbolized by this transition. It is rather about the role their country's slide from magnificence to misery has played in the historical memory of Iranians. So they're two different things. It's not an objective portrayal of what happened in the country, but the way Iranians have remembered this over time, ever since these events. In an effort to construct an image of themselves in accordance with nationalist principles and criteria. I view the 18th century, which is typically seen, if not dismissed, as a dark and difficult period where there is no coherence. I view the 18th century as a pivotal period in the emergence of Iran's modern identity. And I argue that the 18th century was a time of so-called multiple temporalities, which is a term which was proposed by a German philosopher, Reinhard Koselleck. Because it is precisely in this period that the West, quote unquote, or at least the elites of the West, saw the formation of, quote unquote, modernity, meaning a loosening of the bonds between identity and religion, and evincing an increase in self-confidence as the vanguard of a progressive, forward-looking civilization. That doesn't cover modernity, of course, but it's an aspect of modernity, this sort of self-conscious idea of having a superior culture and forward-looking towards, progress, the idea of progress. Historical time evolved very different to Iranian elites, not to speak of the country's common and largely illiterate people. Inhabiting what was essentially a landlocked land in turmoil that had little to offer to outsiders by way of prospective profit, they remained much more isolated from global historical currents than even, say, their peers in the Ottoman lands, adjacent, next to Iran, and Mughal India. In modern parlance, the Ottoman Empire in this period evolved from a land-based empire to a monetary state, and the Turks increasingly became engaged with Europe, in part because they were adjacent to Europe. They fought battles against the Europeans. So they were forced to introduce hardware, military technology, already in the 17th century, and they ended up interacting with the West in rather intensive ways. The crumbling Mughal state on the other side, India in other words, meanwhile, gradually became absorbed in this period into a British-dominated polity. Iranians, in turn, comfortably ensconced in a self-centered worldview, remained secure in their belief that their country and culture were different, sui generis, unique for another century or so. Iran was, sort of a landlocked country, and effectively speaking. It was much harder to get to Iran. It begins with geography, which is often underrated, I think. Iran's relative insularity was, of course, shattered in the early 19th century with the various cruel defeats. Here we have a picture. I'm not really keeping up with my PowerPoint. But, this is Iran in, say, 1700, when it was still at its heyday, the Safavids being, of course, the purple entity towards the right of the image. And the left, meaning the red part, is Ottoman Empire, and green is the Mughal state. This is the sort of a short, a brief image that shows you the intrusion of mostly tribal people that brought the Safavids down. Here we have the 18th century, the mid-18th century, where Iran is divided in different polities, illustrating the chaos into which it falls. Again, Iran's relative insularity was, of course, shattered in the early 19th century with the various cruel defeats. The new regime that had come to power, that of the Qajars, suffered on the battlefields against the Russians. Iranians had always thought of as and dismissed as bibulous, thick-skulled barbarians. That was the traditional image of the Russians. So it was all the more cruel and shocking to be conquered and defeated by these people. So, and the Russians, of course, occupied large swaths of Iranian territory, and I have a few images of that, even though they're out of sequence, unfortunately. Here you have an image that shows you the loss of territory to especially the Russians in the northwest, but also to the British in the east, who incorporated parts of Iran as a buffer between Iran and the Russians and India. And of course, the British engaged in their first real imperialist moves by steaming up the Persian Gulf and establishing strongholds there, and they really pulled ahead to establish commercial and eventually political hegemony in this region as well. Until then, the English in the 17th century were in the Persian Gulf, they were active in the Persian Gulf, but they really operated at the sufferance of the Shah. They didn't really have any power to lord it over Iranians. That begins to change too in the 19th century. So the Iranians come out of this tumultuous 18th century and this turbulent 18th century, a severely weak country, almost ripe for the picking for the new imperialists, who came with new ideas, with forward-looking ideas, with the idea of progress and an idea of an inherent superiority of their own culture. All a far cry from the situation in the 17th century, when things were much more equal. And there was this genuine admiration of Iran and its achievements in the architecture of Isfahan. All that changes. And the 18th century, again, is a pivotal period there. Now, the Iranians reacted to these new developments in various layered and ambivalent ways. They may have been shocked initially by these losses, and they were, the military losses and the suddenness and the intensity of the intrusions of the new order. But in the face of defeat and domination, they ended up in rather pragmatic ways in terms of a reaction. They ended up collaborating with the new forces that be, the British and the Russians. They basically ended up playing them off and maximizing their profits, mostly monetary profit. And even the Shah ended up being in the service and on the payroll of either, and preferably both. That was the most typical reaction of Iranians, really until much longer, really until the late 19th century, if not beyond. But seen in the long term, you might say that in the face of all these defeats, Iranians have been smarting from the loss of their own self-evident sense of greatness ever since the reality of their developmental backwardness started to sink in. Underneath, the memory of being the center of the world and a great nation lingered, and wounded pride about unacknowledged greatness built up, turning over time to deep resentment. Now, there were undercurrents of that already in the early 19th century. Iranians begin to go to Europe, and they come back with glowing reports about the material achievements of the Europeans, England and France and so forth, and you have a creeping sense of sort of deficiency of the Iranians. You know, that we're lacking. We haven't invented anything. There's a new world out there. They're wide-eyed. They don't approve of everything they see in England and in France, but mostly as a positive set of impressions. Something that we don't have, what's wrong. But also genuine admiration. And then it turns in the later 19th century into the idea of social backwardness and even cultural inferiority. It begins to creep in, and it begins to clash against this innate sense that we were supposed to be on top, and for the longest time we were. And then, of course, with the intrusion of modern ideas of nationalism, we see the ushering on of a revalidation of Iranian culture and a gathering sense of wounded pride in the face of, you know, an abiding sense of having lagged behind the developments of the world. And so from the late 19th century onward, you might say, Iranians have been engaged with the world in deeply ambivalent ways, conscious on the one hand of their subordinate status, yet proudly mindful of their historical memory, and increasingly so as it was artificially revived by archaeological findings. There's a saying by an important cultural critic by the name of Partha Chatterjee, an Indian, and he calls it ancient glory, present misery. And one might say it's as applicable to Iran as it is to India, the country he describes in one of his books. Now, throughout Iranian history writing, one finds elements of acute self-awareness of all of this, and of identity formation, mostly expressed by way of nostalgia, by historians driven by a desire to explain, quote unquote, and I'm using a quote here, to explain the loss of their civilization and to protect and perhaps nurture its heritage for the future, unquote. Friedrich Hegel, famous German historian, whose theories resonate until today, argued that a country like Iran, and I think he singles out Iran, had a sense of history in the beginning, but it was marginalized, and in the end they sort of lost the train, or they missed the train of civilization, which is theological, it goes through stages. And so there was no historical memory in a country like Iran over time. And of course, it all leads up to the glorious German sense of self. And, you know, the Germans take the lead in progress. You know, he has the famous saying of Napoleon, the man on the white horse, you know, the great man who makes theory and so forth. But you might say that it is not historical amnesia a la Hegel, but a suffocating surfeit of myth-inspired historical awareness that has been the hallmark of Iran's self-image. In other words, Iranians have long written about, in a sort of nostalgic ways, about loss and nostalgia for the grandeur that they had in the past. And so what they found in modern times, what they retrieved, quote unquote, in a somewhat artificial way, because the real memory had been lost for many centuries, was the figure of Cyrus the Great, in which they managed, that is Iranian historians, and now the Iranian public at large, because it has really percolated to the masses, if you will, in Iran included. If you go to Iran today, there are bookshelves filled with works on pre-Islamic Iran, something that did not exist 30 years ago. They managed to find an avatar of the emancipatory optimism inherent in modern Western influence historiography. You know, Western historiography has long been animated with this idea of growing liberty, which is actually Hegel's thing. You know, the history of the world is the story of an ever-larging emancipatory movement of greater liberty. Now, of course, the Iranian tradition has not been about liberty, it's been about justice. That is the core of Iranian statecraft and Iranian conception of the world and development, if you will. But Iranians have gotten on the train, you will, of Western historiography by incorporating a person quintessentially theirs, Cyrus the Great, and have made him into an avatar of precisely this idea of progress, liberty, and freedom. Anachronistically, you might say. because he has become the personification of justice, but even more anachronistically, the world's first protagonist of human rights. And that's how he's known today. The cylinder symbolizes precisely that, the famous cylinder of Cyrus. You know, he's the one who imparted, the first one to impart civil rights, human rights. But of course, Achaemenid times, pre-Islamic times, are the stuff of legend more than of history. And in their search for a more recent, better documented golden age, Iranians have constructed the Safavid period as the lieu de mémoire par excellence, to use a complicated French term. You know, this idea of a touchstone of historical memory, and it's a little bit like the Germans. You know, when you look at German history, the way Germans have tried to find greatness and grandeur in their own history, where did they go? Certainly after 1945. They couldn't go to the Nazi period because it's just misery and disgrace and horror. They couldn't go to the 18th century because they were really influenced and dominated by sort of French foppishness. You know, the upper classes spoke French and everyone wanted to be French fashion-wise and food-wise and so forth. And the 17th century is a third, you know, it's the famous or the infamous 30 Years' War, the wars of religion. I mean, Central Europe was devastated. It was a time of horror. So the Germans ended up sort of glorifying the Middle Ages, the last time when they were great and wonderful and ran through the forests, knights, and fighting for justice and chivalry. So that's why the German sort of glorification of the Middle Ages comes from. Iranians have done something similar, and they have retrieved the Safavid period, if you will, sort of made it into a usable past for their own self-perceived grandeur. Iranian historiography, of course, has also long been marked by a sense of perseverance, filled with redemptive suffering in the face of foreign-inflicted loss and defeat, followed by regeneration and rebirth. This idea of, we've always been beleaguered and invaded by foreign forces, but, there's like the phoenix, like we have always risen from the ashes. And we have actually incorporated and subdued the invaders by way of our superior culture. And the various phases there, we have the Arab invasion and ultimately the Mongol invasion, and they're similar. They're barbarians, they were barbarians, and they conquered us all right. But through our sophistication, our cultural, superior culture, we have ultimately subdued these people, and they became submerged in our, again, age-old civilization, if you will. Now, how about the 18th century? Modern Iranians have sought to weave the 18th century into a continuous national narrative, because that's what nationalism wants. It wants an unbroken line, right, in sort of a teleological manner. A narrative of loss and regeneration through resilience, and again, this sort of phoenix-like resurgence after foreign invasion, by highlighting two figures. Let's see, now I have to go back, and I'm sorry for the mess up in the sequence. First of all, Nadia Shah. And here's the statue of Nadia Shah. No, here's not the statue of Nadia Shah. Here's the statue of Nadia Shah. Statue of Nadia Shah in Mashhad. And here we have a contemporary image of Nadia Shah. And the other figure has been highlighted is that of Karim Khan and Zand. As the two rulers who seem to provide some coherence in what is otherwise an inchoate, chaotic period, the 18th century. Tribal warfare, ephemeral rulings, lots of bloodshed, and no coherence, no national sort of entity that one can look at and use as an organizing principle. Nader Shah and Karim Khan Zand have been singled out, focusing on the role of the former as a brilliant warrior who liberated the country from foreign control and restored Iran's military might, and Karim Khan as sort of the counterpart, the benevolent ruler who didn't even want to become be called Shah, because he was a servant of the people. So the bad guy or the strong-willed guy against the one who took care of his own people. Those are the two figures, the pivotal figures of the 18th century. And you look at any book, any historiography of Iran, and those two stand out. Both Iranian and Western historiography about Iran. So the rest of my paper, and really the heart of the paper, is about one of these, Nader Shah. Now, the portrayal of Nader in the 18th century West is very interesting because it was center and front. It was a combined outcome of eyewitness accounts. There were some foreigners there, Persian language sources, and Enlightenment anxieties. That is really sort of the operative principle in the way Europeans tended to view Nader. Europeans were still puzzled by the sudden fall of the Safavids, the height of this Eastern sophistication. And they saw Nader Shah typically as a dynamic warlord who might rescue his nation by liberating it from the barbarians who had invaded this ancient, cultured land. That is Turks, Afghans, Uzbeks, people like that. As early as 1738, and Nader was still building his empire at the time. He had not really come to full Shahdom, if you will. As early as 1738, a huge tome appeared in Germany depicting Nader as a divinely inspired savior of his nation. And Nader really exploded on the scene, in the European scene that is, with his defeat of the Mughal emperor, because Nader went on an expedition to India, eyeing the riches of Mughal India, and ended up going all the way to Delhi, sacked Delhi. Reportedly 30,000 people were killed in a bloodbath, and he took untold wealth back to Iran. The peacock throne, the famous crown jewels of Iran are loot taken back to Iran by Nader Shah. And the image of Nader in the Western press was really formed and fashioned exactly at that point, 1739, which is the year of his invasion. There's actually an interesting Dutch report in manuscript form that describes in minute detail, coming out of India, where the Dutch were commercially active, his operation and his exploits and so forth. And the earliest narrative about his exploits was actually printed following that year in 1740 in Dutch, and inspired the first major commercial publication about Nader Shah, de l'histoire de Tamas Kouli Khan, Sophie de Perse, in French, published in Amsterdam in 1741. And then it was translated to Spanish and into English. And then in 1742, the Anglo-Saxon world became thoroughly acquainted with Nader Shah through the famous work by James Fraser called History of Nader Shah, which was mostly based on eyewitness report from the English, the few merchants who were still in Iran at the time. So there was a solid foundation. Now, Nader Shah, of course, was so popular in Europe because he represented a number of anxieties in Europe about how a sophisticated land like Iran, because it was known as sophisticated, far more sophisticated than the clodhoppers, the Turks next door, who were simply barbarians who had come from Central Asia, an ancient land found in the Bible, filled with poetry, much of which was already known and resonated in Europe at the time. How come this sophisticated land had fallen so hard and so fast and so cruelly to a bunch of warlords? It produced all this anxiety about the fate of civilizations, the fragility of civilizations, the fickleness of fate that could turn on a dime. You could fall from admittedly an overripe and debauched country in the late Safavid period, but you could fall hard and fast into the depth of barbarism. It was a lesson. It was kind of a horror movie, the way we go to the movies, to look at the apocalypse because we're inherently fearing that same thing, that civilization might break down, you might say, right? So that goes into the way why Nader Shah was so popular, if you will, in 18th century Europe. And you see this in some of the frontispieces from that same period. I think this is the one from James Fraser, quintessentially 18th century sensibility. And here, Nader became the topic of several plays in Holland in 1745, as you can see, and in France and in Italy, as this warlord, this enigmatic warlord, cruel but also magnanimous and powerful. And he became known as sort of, an emblem of discipline. In Holland, he became an avatar of republicanism, the poor guy from common, unaristocratic background who had risen to the top and who took care of his people. It was all fictitious and imaginative and fantasyful, but still, this is how he was received. His cruelty didn't go unnoticed because he was immensely cruel. If you look at Fraser's rendering, and especially that of John Hanway, who was a British a merchant who also was in Iran in that same period, and who actually met Nader and visited his camp. And he goes to great lengths to describing the utter and gratuitous cruelty of Nadia Shah. So that didn't go unnoticed. Now, Iranians following Nader had the same ambivalence about Nader. Both his undeniable cruelty and especially the horror of his Indian campaign, leading to enormous bloodshed, but at the same time, a disciplined man, a warlord who, pulled his troops together, had the loyalty of his troops, liberated the country, threw the foreigners out, if you will. So those two poles remained pivotal to the image of Iran. From the very beginning, they were there. So, the people writing in his direct orbit, his own historiographers, the chroniclers, of course, such as the famous Muhammad Mehdi Asrabadi, they either ignored or looked away from the horrors, or they blamed the victims, because of course they had to worry about their own skin. They only had to write good things about Nader because they were in his service. But later on you see, again, that sort of ambivalence about Nader. You see this in Rustam al-Hukama, who writes his picturesque work, very interesting, blend of fact and fiction. Rustam al-Tabarikh, it's called. He faults Iran for Nader for draining Iran of its wealth and for the general mismanagement that he perpetrated. So this is kind of a realistic picture. But we also have a perception of Iran being, Nader Shah being the one who liberated Iran from foreign domination. Now, then we move into the Qajar period. That is the rulers who took power in the late 19th century. These are some images, by the way, of Nader's military exploits. Of course, he was most known for his campaigning. And here we have an interesting image. This one is particularly interesting because here he, as the caption says, carrying the Kohinoor, the famous diamond that he robbed from India, in his turban. And he exchanged turbans here in marrying couples, elders, and this is really about sort of, symbolizing the subjugation of India by Nader. And here we have the same kind of image. Nader is receiving Indian representatives of the defeated court of the Mughals. So and this is of course a picture of the famous peacock throne that he took from Delhi. This is his sort of stronghold where he was from in northern Khorasan. And here we move into the Qajar period. When we look at the Qajar and the way they described him, we see a new dynasty coming to power of questionable roots and legitimacy. The Qajars didn't have much by the way of credentials. And they had to sort of take their distance from the preceding rulers, as dynasties typically do. So you chisel out the names of the preceding pharaoh in order to establish your own credentials, and that's precisely what they did. So they had to be negative about their predecessors, except for the Safavids, because the Safavids, after all, had the religious credentials that the Qajars themselves so sorely lacked, because the Safavids were identified with having introduced Shiism and made that into their official religion, something that still holds, of course, until today. So the Safavids were beyond criticism in that sense. But someone like Nadia Shah, of course, could be criticized for, cruelty and mismanagement and having sort of squandered the riches of Iran. And there is an element of that. You have Agha Muhammad Khan. This is an image of Tehran, the newly selected capital. And beyond that, or preceding that, this is the founder of the Qajars, Agha Muhammad Khan. Himself a brutal and exceedingly cruel warlord, and he sought to erase the memory of Nader by destroying his sepulchre, his grave, which was located next to the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad originally. He unearthed the bones and had them removed, reburied, first in Tehran and later in Najaf in Iraq, so out of the way, if you will. But at the same time, you see how Agha Muhammad Khan also must have been impressed by Nader, because he had two figures added to the paintings adorning the walls of the Chehel Satun Palace in Esfahan, representing Nader in various poses, among them subjugating India. So there was a sense of collective pride there, presumably. And also, you know, Nader also figures on one of the main walls of the newly built Gulistan Palace, which was built by the early Qajars. In the early 19th century, we have two developments that help to shape a new or at least a more complex image of Nader Shah. It's my next to last point. One is the string of defeats, humiliating defeats that I've already alluded to. Iran losing wars against the Russians and losing lots of territory in the northwest, territory that, truth be told, they had conquered and invaded earlier themselves, you know, Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan today, these newly independent countries. And the other one was the meteoric rise of Napoleon, who, of course, followed a career that affected the world from the east coast of the United States until as far as the Indian Ocean. The military weakness of the Qajars and the tremendous loss of land they suffered quickly detracted from their aura and required a success story. People began to be disgusted with the Qajars very early on. And they wanted, you know, some source of pride. So they retrieved Nader Shah as at least a man who had stood tall, had reorganized the army, had given Iran pride, chased out the foreigners, as opposed to these weak and worthless Qajars. So that is one element. And you see this, for example, the Jahan-Gushay Naderi, which is the main work of Asrabadi, the one I mentioned before, goes through 14 printings, so 14 editions in this early Qajar period, suggesting their popularity, of its popularity. Now, and then we have Napoleon, and it gets very interesting here, because there's a relationship between Napoleon and Nader Shah in Iran and in Europe that seems something like a dialogic engagement. Napoleon saw himself as a latter-day Nader. He was very conscious of Nader, and I'll come to that. Nader Shah, in due time and in good Orientalist fashion, became known first in Europe and later in Iran as the Asian Napoleon, and completing this cycle in an anti-Orientalist fashion, Napoleon is now often called the European Nader. Okay? And it is very clear, we know, all indications are that Napoleon was very impressed with Nader Shah. We know this from French ambassadors who go to the court of Fatali Shah in 1807, 1808, carrying letters from Napoleon, where he explains that, you know, he thinks Nader is a great warrior, which is somewhat injudicious because Fatali Shah, the reigning monarch, was rather weak and not into waging war. So referring to his forebear as being a great warrior, great man, is of course not very politique, but that's the way he presented himself, or, you know, Nader Shah in this letter. And Napoleon, in turn, made a great impression in Iran. We know that the lasting one at that, because it's still around to some extent, and it certainly lasted for more than a century. You know, Napoleon became known as a leader who stood for organizational skill, wisdom, sophistication. And John Malcolm, the one with whom I began, relates how in 1810 Napoleon's name, quote, was familiar to numbers in Persia, and some few understood the character of his power. He had a friend, that is, Malcolm had a friend, someone by the name of Agha Muhammad Qasim Valeh of Isfahan, a poet and a philosopher, who told Malcolm that in his opinion, this Bonaparte is a wonderful man. He wields empires as if they were clubs, and speculating that after coming to terms with the Ottomans, this Western Genghis Khan, you know, hearkening back to Genghis Khan of the Mughals, might take on Iran and Russia and then make use of both to overthrow your British power in India. And it goes on from there, because we know that Abbas Mirza, the main reformer of the... why don't I have this? Oh, here he is. The main reformer, No, this is not him. I forgot to include a picture of him, and I apologize for that. The crown prince, who effectively rules northwestern Iran, oldest son, and the presumed heir-to-be, who was the first one to introduce Western technology, Western military, hardware, and so forth, was also a great admirer of Bonaparte. And we know the same thing about the Shah who follows, and that is the last picture I have, Mohammad Shah Qajar, who's otherwise not that remarkable, but we know that he was interested in having a copy of the life of Napoleon, and he commissioned a translation of another biography of Napoleon. So Napoleon remained very interesting. But when we look at the way the image of Nader, by way of Napoleon in part, is shaped in Iran over time in the 19th century, we come back to Malcolm, to John Malcolm. Because the image that was fashioned in the 20th century, certainly in the 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, was in some way a calque on the way John Malcolm especially portrayed Nader. To Malcolm, Nadia Shah was a force of nature, a barbarian who acted to purify the overripe civilization from which he himself sprang. You know, there is an earlier commentator on the fall of the Safavids, Father Kruzinski, a Polish priest who was an eyewitness to the fall of Isfahan, and he describes the Afghans as perhaps a purifying force. Yes, barbarians, but they brought down a decadent civilization, the Safavids, and they might in turn become civilized through the residue of Persian civilization. Okay? Malcolm talks about Nadir Shah, again, as a volcanic force who had rejuvenated Persian culture precisely by ridding it of the Afghan invaders and of their primitivism. Malcolm really saw Nadir Shah the way Edward Gibbon, the famous historian, saw Attila the Hun, as a great warrior and a disciplinarian who had liberated his people from the yoke of the barbarians. He was full of admiration of Nadir's military prowess, and he self-servingly painted a redeeming portrait of the 18th century empire builder that he was, based on the anticipation of the unfolding of his own empire, that of the British. So he looked at Nader on the one hand as a disciplinarian, a great military leader, someone who brought grandeur to his country, and as a sort of a predecessor of what the British were about to embark on, creating an empire. Of course, when it comes to the Indian campaign, he had to be a little careful because the British themselves were about to invade India. So he had to sort of massage that away, as sort of an aberration, if you will. Now, and then Malcolm gets translated into Persian in 1870. It's one thing to write a book in English in 1815, which remains unknown to Iranians, but no one reads English, of course. But in 1870 it's translated to Persian. And you see a renewed interest and a new interpretation of Nadir by way of the way Malcolm describes him. So we have a very interesting, and this is really the point of my talk, way of retrieving one's identity in a very complex way, using Western models, integrating them, making them useful and usable for your own purposes, and not even necessarily being aware of this as a cultural process. So how has Nadir fared in modern historiography? My last point. The fall of the Qajars in the 1920s and the rise of Reza Khan inaugurated yet a new phase in the dialectical process of historiography with regard to Nadir Shah. British Foreign Secretary Victor Mallet in 1925 insisted that Nadir Shah was Reza Khan's great hero, adding that he would not be surprised if the new ruler would model his career on that of Nadir. And so just as the early Qajars had tried to exercise their previous regimes, including that of Nadir, so the historians who came of age in the 20s and the 30s under the auspices of Reza Shah followed the line of the new regime by decrying the stagnation and the backwardness, the loss of land their country had suffered because of the horribly weak Qajars, which inevitably entailed a reevaluation of the last ruler who had stood strong for a great and militarily independent Iran, Nadir Shah. So Nader acquired a new significance, you might say. They incorporated Malcolm and his vindicating approach of Nader into their own imagining of him and of their own country and its role in history. So he really became known as the one who expelled the foreigners and who was elected by the people during this famous Qurultai, this powwow in the plain of Moran, where supposedly the people had elected him to be their ruler, which is of course enforced, because those who disagreed were, executed at the time. So in modern times, to end, Nader has remained very controversial. For some, he is simply the uncultured barbarian, tribal chieftain who destroyed the vestige of the glorious empire of the Safavids. For others, he remains a warrior who restored Iran's pride by driving out the foreigners who had occupied their country, the Afghans, the Ottomans, the Russians. I'll spare you names of various people, except that I will bring out two last people who, because they represent a new twist on this whole thing. One is Abdul Hadi Ha'iri, who wrote an important, albeit profoundly theological work on the encounter between Iran and the West. The main theme of which is that Iranians in the 18th century especially ignored both the lure and the threat of the West. Then in the early modern period, they neither took full advantage of the technical and scientific advantages and advances that Europe had to offer, nor paid enough attention to the imperialist and colonial designs represented by Westerners, Europeans. And he includes Nadia Shah in that whole image, in that whole picture. He argues that Nader was too busy making war to take really advantage of the new hardware and military techniques that were available. And he also was somewhat naive because he had no eye for the imperialist schemes of the Europeans. And this comes through in his interaction with foreigners, with the Dutch, what was left of the Dutch because they were on their way out, too much chaos, no profits to be made, and the English, who were basically retreating as well. And then we end up with the Islamic Republic. In the Islamic Republic, in modern Iran, Islamic Republic, old impulses and new realities have combined to produce a deeply conspiracy-fueled view of the world, one in which power is always manipulated, typically by foreigners, and where Iran is forever the target of foreign powers seeking to weaken and subdue it and take advantage of its wealth and of its resources. So in the Islamic Republic, and of course there are precedents in the Pahlavi period, nationalist and anti-imperialist history have become twinned in historiography. There's no question. It's demonstrably true. And so fired in this crucible, Nader Shah emerges not just as a strong warrior who kicked out the foreigners, but as a full-fledged anti-imperialist. And then sort of we come full circle when we have the argument advanced by some that his Indian campaign was a tool in a scheme concocted by foreigners. That even his Indian scheme was not his own making, but it was the British who made him do it quite simply and succinctly. And there's one book by a fellow that otherwise remains unknown to me, at least Zawish. I don't know if any of you know this fellow. He's written one of these many books of the influence and destructive influence by foreigners on Iranian history. And he argues once that Nader Shah is an emblem of the popular struggle for national liberation, but that he ultimately sort of fell prey to a schemer, a British merchant by the name of John Elton, who ended up being in his service and who manipulated him to go to India and sort of sidetracked him from his true calling, namely liberating Iran. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for very stimulating.
You're welcome.
We have some time left for questions. Are there any questions in the audience?
I have one.
Yes.
You mentioned the fall of the Safavids created this anxiety that had ripple effects in the sort of cultural milieu, intellectual milieu of Europe.
Yes.
In terms of how civilization is so fickle and could
Right.
fall apart in
Sure.
It reminds me of Ibn Khaldun's theory of rise and fall of civilization, rise and fall of dynasties.
Right.
Did historians of 18th, 19th century Iran, were they aware of such a theory by Ibn Khaldun? Because Iranians have this penchant towards fatalism, this cyclical notion.
Yes.
Rise and fall naturally.
Yeah.
Were they aware of this?
Yeah.
Ibn Khaldun's
No, the answer is yes and no, meaning that yes, of course, deeply ingrained is this idea of, it's the wheel of fortune, right? And it can go either way. It's a cyclical thing anyway, so things come and go, including civilizations. So it's sort of a resignation to that. It's God ordained and so forth. But no, in the sense that not specifically related to Ibn Khaldun's theory. I have to look up when Ibn Khaldun became known in Iran, but I have never seen any indication that was in the 18th century. It's in the 19th century and probably in the late 19th century. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if in this case too, it's not Ibn Khaldun directly translated from Arabic, but translated through the French. There's of course a famous translation, 1845, Quatremer is a French Orientalist who translates the Muqaddimah, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's through that intermediary that Ibn Khaldun becomes known in Europe, in Iran, and if that's the case, it's no sooner than the late 19th century.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. I guess I was curious to hear your reflections on how this piece, this larger project, maybe speaks to a broader comparative question of the architect's idea of the maybe almost universal perception of past glory and present misery.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly, I guess, I wanted to sort of push you a little bit in the sense that my understanding of your talk today is you really identified changes in the regime as points at which people change their understanding of the past, of a particular figure in the past,
Right.
either exemplary or tragic, right?
Sure.
And that it has a lot to do with rules and regimes, especially kind of trying to establish themselves.
Sure.
Your talk made me think of, I don't know if you're familiar with Cornel Fleischer's book
Mhm.
from the 80s,
Right.
Bureaucrat and Intellectual.
Yeah, of
Very
course.
much about the kind of origins of the
Right.
hominid
Right.
theory,
Yes.
which
Yes.
he pinpoints as, I mean, it's not all
Mm-hmm.
the work of this one bureaucrat intellectual, but then clearly there was a sort of sense, even in almost as the golden age
Was still Peter.
was still peaking.
Right.
Later stuff.
That things had gone awry. Yeah.
Right. In other words, to what extent is this idea of past glory, present misery, just a kind of universal, almost expression of nostalgia? And to what extent does it really? And do you see sort of points in Iranian historiography where people are in the midst of what later became the Golden Age and say, "Oh, look at this terrible state that we're in. It was so much better." X number of years.
Yeah, there are, well, both, I think in both counts you're right. I think there's, I didn't present this as uniquely Iranian. I just gave Iran as a case study. And perhaps I didn't put it enough in a larger context. But absolutely, by all means, there are universal elements here. The past is always better than the present, right? And we're always sort of looking back to a golden age and the founding fathers of whatever, in whatever variant. So in that sense, there's nothing extraordinary about it. As to the second part of your observation, there are some elements there in the period that I'm familiar with, and that is the late Safavid period, even though most of it is subsequent to the actual fall of Isfahan, sort of groping for explanations, bewildered, what happened, Not only we have this great civilization, but it was brought down by a ragtag bunch of 10,000 Afghans on camels. What the hell happened? Within 6 months, Isfahan fell and the whole thing dissolved. But it's already there before. And you have a strand of historiography which blames it on the clerics for part. The clerics, who have taken great power and become sort of central to the state and the ideology it projects. And it is part of the disintegration of the state. Arguably, that's part of the argument that I make in the book that I wrote and published 2 years ago, the Persian Crisis. But already before, you have certain, there's always been an anti-clerical element in Iranian history. I should add that by way of explanation. They say, it's these horrible clerics who introduce all this hypocrisy and this debauchery. They preach high principles, and yet they drink wine and they go whoring, when no one looks. So they have sapped the moral fiber in society. So that is a good example of something, of sort of a declinist discourse which goes on while at least on the surface, things are still going strong. And what one could perhaps identify other examples as well, even though they don't come readily to mind. Yes.
I'm fascinated by this notion of historiography and the re-scripting of
Right.
leaders to
Sure.
different personas given the needs of
Right.
the present.
Sure. We do it all the time, of course. And again, there's nothing natural about it. Yeah.
But I'd like to ask you about the possibilities, what possibilities have been, say, in the 20th century for Iranian historians who might have sought to break out of that kind of mold, to re-examine historical sources.
Right.
What sort of, because sometimes the political systems themselves,
Right.
even sort of the broader kind of cultural intellectual systems, don't allow that kind of
Right.
and sometimes the sources aren't there, they're not as
Right,
available. So
right,
I just,
yeah,
if you could
yeah.
tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
one, access to sources, and two,
Sure.
what sort of successive regimes in the
Right.
20th century allowed in terms of freedom to reinterpret.
Right. Well, you've answered half of your own question, because both under the Shah and in the Islamic Republic, for different reasons, and in part the same reasons, there was no room for an expansion of the discourse, because everything was sort of harnessed and put into the straitjacket of a rather narrow-minded type of nationalism, national grandeur. So there was no room for free interpretation. There was also no freedom of speech, of course, in both cases. So what Iranian historiographers became very good at was recycling ideas, and putting out lots of sort of texts, meaning editing existing texts rather than engaging in groundbreaking and discourse widening types of discussions. And then when it comes to sources, there have been and still are huge impediments as well, which are partly linguistic and partly having to do with financial means. If you want to do proper Iranian history, Safavid period, for example, beyond religious history, because there you can sort of, knowledge of Persian and English and maybe Arabic suffices. But if you want to do, any kind of other types of history, it's not only necessary, but in some cases imperative to know, Russian and certainly French and German, in the sense that in the 19th century anything was written in French by way of secondary literature. And perhaps Dutch, if you want to do economic history. Well, that's an array of languages that's not, cannot be presumed and made a precondition for serious study. And then there are, of course, the archives, which are almost by definition not located in Iran for the early modern period. So you have to go to London and to Paris and The Hague and so forth. So it takes lots of money and an institutional framework to support all of that. And in that sense, Iran has not really been in a position to take full advantage of that either. So there are lots of different obstacles that militate against sort of a free discourse. Now it's potentially possible with a new generation of Iranian scholars having come to the West also and gone to graduate school with different perceptions, different approaches, different learning methods and so forth, and the resources that enable them to go to Paris and London and so forth, and hopefully in the future establish a base of operation in Iran. But that's, of course, an imponderable. We don't know how that will work out. But so far it's been difficult for all these reasons. Yes. Yes.
So the answer to my question is going to be a little bit more speculative.
Okay.
There are those who believe that in the absence of Nadia Shah, Iran would have fallen apart geographically as a country and largely culturally as well? What do you believe?
That's, of course, a counterfactual question, and yes, you gave the pointer. It's speculative, and I would almost agree instinctively that if Nadia Shah had not created a semblance of coherence, even though it fell apart fairly quickly because he was like Timur Lenk, he was too much in a rush, professional warrior who never paused to consolidate anything. But still, he created some kind of momentum that did, if only in a historical memory, last. So perhaps he did prevent Iran from sort of devolving and dissolving into an internally inchoate, tribal amalgamation of warlords running around. But again, I say that hesitantly because we don't know.